In a high-rise building.
There was no warning.
At sea.
Innocent people died.
In a train.
Everything was on fire. Everything was burning.
Disasters can begin with the smallest things.
Changing the opening hours of a restaurant.
The bad glue job. A paperwork error.
Now, combining the latest research with every available source of evidence, experts will forensically analyze 3 disasters, down to each tiny detail.
You've really got to think outside the box.
You have to work your way back and understand each link in the chain.
State-of-the-art graphics reveal every critical detail at every critical moment.
This whole disaster could have been averted.
We can dissect them, get inside, or underneath, freeze time, and even reverse it. To conduct a complete disaster autopsy. Europe, the Alps. At 15,766 feet, Mont Blanc is Western Europe's highest mountain. Deep inside the solid rock runs a road tunnel more than 7 miles long, connecting France with Italy. When it opened in 1965, it was the world's longest road tunnel.
There'll be 2 carriageways about 12 feet wide, and you'll be able to drive under Mont Blanc in less than a quarter of an hour.
By the late 90s, about 2 million vehicles were going through the tunnel every year.
The tunnel is carefully designed to keep these drivers safe.
There are smoke and heat detectors throughout the length of the tunnel, refuge rooms with their own independent air supply. We also have emergency telephones and fire extinguishers at regular intervals.
Even today, the Mont Blanc Tunnel is an extraordinary feat of engineering.
But on March 24th, 1999, the safety systems fail. A lethal fire breaks out deep inside the tunnel.
It took more than 2 days for it to be put out.
39 people die. It is one of the deadliest road tunnel disasters in history. Now, by analyzing all the available evidence, we will digitally reconstruct the Mont Blanc tunnel disaster to answer the question: what went wrong?
We have a range of evidence that we can look at to understand this fire. There's the remains of 36 vehicles that were left inside the tunnel after the fire. We have eyewitness accounts, and we also have data from an array of sensors that were located within the tunnel.
The first evidence of the disaster comes from one of these sensors. At 10:52, a smoke detector at rest area 18 triggers an alarm in the control room at the French end. This matches eyewitness testimony from truck driver Gilbert de Grave.
J'ai regardé mes rétroviseurs et j'ai vu de la fumée du côté droit. Ben, j'ai mis mes feux de position de détresse pour prévenir derrière qu'il y a un problème, pour éviter un incident, bien sûr.
According to his statement, de Grave pulls over into rest area 21. Within minutes, a fire breaks out in his truck. Video evidence reveals the astonishing aftermath of this small truck fire.
So what we see is the burnt-out shell of the lorry around rest area 21, about halfway through the tunnel towards the Italian side. But we can see 35 destroyed vehicles on either side of the truck. 22 lorries, 10 cars, 2 emergency vehicles, and 1 motorcycle spread over a distance of around half a mile.
The evidence is clear. The disaster begins when de Grave's truck catches fire. But records show there have been at least 17 previous vehicle fires in the tunnel without a single loss of life. Why is this one so deadly? Using data from the tunnel's control rooms, we can piece together the timeline of the disaster.
De Graaf's truck is recorded passing through the tolls and entering the French portal of the tunnel at about 10:46 a.m.
6 minutes later, at 10:52, the smoke detector at rest area 18 is triggered, the first warning of the disaster.
But it's not until about 10:55 a.m., 3 minutes later, that operators stop vehicles entering the tunnel on both sides.
Why isn't access to the tunnel stopped immediately?
This tunnel was equipped with 2 control rooms, one on the French side and one on the Italian side.
We know from documentation that the sensors in the French side of the tunnel are routed to the French control room and the Italian side of the tunnel to the Italian control room. And that means when the alarms start going off for Area 18, the Italians have no idea because the sensors are only going off on the French side.
And the French sensor readings only show some smoke. That could just be from a badly polluting vehicle engine.
The Italians only become aware of the unfolding disaster when they receive an emergency call.
The Italians immediately tell the French that there is a serious fire. This means the tunnel isn't closed to traffic until 9 minutes after De Graaf's truck enters, and 3 minutes after the smoke sensor is triggered.
That might not sound like very much time, but that is an eternity when you have a burning vehicle. To give some context to that, in that time, 18 trucks and 10 more cars enter the tunnel.
Of the 39 people who die in the fire, 37 enter the tunnel in that 9-minute gap. Why does the disaster get out of control so fast?
According to the truck's manifest, it was carrying 12 tons of flour and 9 tons of margarine, a load that most people would imagine to be pretty innocuous.
But the construction of the truck reveals a hidden problem.
Because it was carrying margarine, the trailer was in fact refrigerated, and therefore it was insulated.
The insulation is made from a material called polyurethane, which is highly flammable.
Once the fire had spread from the cab to the trailer itself, the shell would have begun to burn.
When the insulation ignites, it creates a completely unexpected new hazard.
That would start to warm up the margarine. Now, the margarine at that point would begin to melt. The result is it would start to run and give off a flammable vapor. At this point, you've really got problems.
It's not the burning truck that leads to disaster. It's the margarine.
As the fire takes hold and the margarine and its packaging begin to melt and pour out of the back of the trailer, this whole horrible burning mixture is going to be gently sliding, pouring down the slope of the tunnel towards the oncoming traffic.
The situation has transformed from a small truck fire into a lethal disaster.
After the fire, 27 victims were found still in their vehicles.
Why don't these victims simply drive away from the spreading margarine fire?
4 of the passenger cars that entered after De Graaf's truck were found pointing at an angle suggesting they were trying to make a U-turn to escape from the smoke and the heat.
Why don't they manage to escape?
As the fire burns, it's going to be taking oxygen from the air.
The problem is that vehicle engines need oxygen to work.
It seems as though the smoke didn't have enough oxygen in it to allow the engines to keep running.
Unable to escape, the victims are killed by the toxic smoke before the flames even reach them. But there is a curious pattern to these fatalities. Every single death is on the French side of the truck fire. Not one person dies on the Italian side. Why?
Data from the smoke detectors shows that the smoke was traveling at about 4.5 miles an hour in the region close to De Graaf's truck, but it was approaching 15 miles an hour as it got close to the French portal.
This evidence shows the smoke accelerating away from the Italian side. What could cause the smoke to behave like this? Plans for the tunnel show that it is designed with 5 ventilation ducts on the French side and 5 identical ones on the Italian side.
Whilst 4 of the ventilation shafts could only work in one direction, ventilation shaft 5 could be switched over from exhaust to supply.
Witness reports show that the Italians in the control center saw people fleeing the tunnel at the Italian side. They turned on a supply of fresh air through duct number 5.
But according to eyewitness reports, on the French side, the number 5 fan remains set to exhaust. The Italian side is now blowing air in. The French side is sucking it out.
By supplying air at maximum flow rate through duct number 5, this is creating a flow of smoke towards the French side. So the evidence suggests that this fast-moving smoke may have led to unintended loss of life on the French side.
One final question remains. What starts the fire in de Graaf's truck? According to the statement of truck driver de Graaf, he first sees the smoke in the Mont Blanc Tunnel come from under the cab of his truck.
In de Graaf's truck, the engine was positioned below the cab, so the fact that he could see smoke coming out from beneath him suggests that an engine fire is a potentially likely cause.
Other drivers say that they saw smoke from de Graaf's cab shortly after he entered the tunnel. This suggests that the fire started either shortly after de Graaf entered the tunnel or even before he entered it.
Is it possible for de Graaf's engine to catch fire on the approach to the tunnel? The answer may be simple geography. The tunnel is in the Alps, and the Alps are the highest mountains in Europe.
You have to climb a 2.5-mile winding road, and it takes you up to 4,000 feet of altitude. So imagine driving your truck, pulling a heavy load, particularly as the air gets thinner as you reach higher altitude and your engine's having to work harder and harder. In 4 of the 5 last reported cases where firefighters put out truck fires, engine overheating was listed as the most probable cause of those fires.
Because the inferno is so destructive, insufficient evidence survives to definitively prove how the fire starts. But we can now identify the key sequence of events that leads to this disaster. As Gilbert de Graaf's truck enters the tunnel, a small fire begins inside the engine bay, possibly from overheating. The fire grows quickly, and de Graaf abandons his burning truck at around the halfway point. The heat from the cab fire ignites the flammable insulation surrounding the cargo of margarine.
The heat of the fire starts to melt and vaporize the margarine, and the entire flaming mixture pours out of the back of the truck.
Burning fluids, including margarine, fuel, and oil, run down the bottom of the tunnel, spreading it more than half a mile.
Italian operators reverse the ventilation to help people escape, but this unintentionally blows toxic smoke down the French side of the tunnel. Vehicles in the tunnel fail from lack of oxygen, and the smoke moves too fast to escape on foot. 39 people are killed. After the fire, the tunnel is closed for almost 3 years. Its safety features and operations are completely overhauled.
There are sensors installed at the tolls that can detect if trucks are overheating, even before they get into the tunnel. And there's now a new underground escape tunnel with a separate supply of fresh air that runs the length of the tunnel.
One of the key changes after the fire is that there is now one fire station in the middle that's overseen by a single authority.
Disaster can strike in places we least expect, on a car journey through the Alps, or something as apparently mundane as a shopping trip. Seoul, South Korea, 1995. The Sampoong department store is a towering, bright pink symbol of South Korea's commercial success. It is located in the heart of one of the city's most desirable and profitable locations. People flock to it.
The Sampoong shopping center had been open for just under 6 years, and it served over 40,000 shoppers a day, bringing in just under $4 million a week.
June 29th, 1995 is typically busy.
There were over 1,000 shoppers in the center, parking their cars in the basement. eating in the food court on the upper floors, and just shopping in between.
At 5:57 p.m., the north wing collapses. The packed store is reduced to rubble in less than 20 seconds. More than 900 people are injured. 502 are killed.
This was the worst peacetime disaster that South Korea had ever experienced, and it resulted in police investigations, multiple arrests, and a revisit to government policy.
Using detailed analysis of the wreckage site, photographic evidence, and witness statements, we will digitally reconstruct the Sampoong disaster to answer the question: what went wrong? What do we know about the doomed wing of the department store?
Sampoong department store is a 9-story tall building. 4-story the basement and 5 above the ground.
When a building falls, the foundations that underpin the entire structure are always a prime suspect. And Sampoong building records point to a possible problem here.
The Sampoong departmental store was built on a landfill area. So it's plausible to think that the ground was unconsolidated and not stiff enough, and that caused some problems with the structure.
Is that theory supported by the evidence?
When we look into the photographic evidence, there's nothing that suggests that there was problems with the foundations.
In fact, many people only survived because they were in the basement. This suggests that the cause of the collapse is not in the foundations or basement. That is supported by a critical witness statement from a security guard. If the ceiling caves in, the collapse must begin above. The building collapses onto the basement. It's a miracle anyone down there survives. Could there be a flaw in the design of the entire building? The collapsed Sampoong department store is built using what's known as a flat slab structure.
Now, a really common way to design a multi-story building is to have flat concrete slabs, one on top of the other, that are supported by columns. And these columns sit right on top of each other in order to funnel the loads from the top of the building straight down into the foundation in a continuous way.
Flat slab construction is used all over the world. If you abide with the rules and if you are careful with the detailing, it works perfectly fine.
There is nothing suspicious about the way Sampoong is designed. Could there be a problem with the way it is built? One clue could lie in the evolution of the building's purpose.
Sampoong departmental store wasn't initially conceived as a departmental store, but it was envisaged as an office building. Only after the first set of approvals, it was changed as a commercial building.
The engineering design of a department store is fundamentally different to that of an office block. For a start, an office block generally uses elevators, but a department store needs big escalators. They need big holes in the concrete floor slabs. These not only weaken the design, but they require fire shutters to prevent fire spreading upwards through these holes. These shutters are not part of the original design. Fitting them requires further concerning changes.
They not only had to take large chunks of the slabs off, but they also, on several levels, they had to trim some of the columns.
These are the concrete columns that are holding the building up.
These types of alterations will significantly weaken a flat slab structure, but in this case, they were all within the bounds of what was permitted within the building regulations. They shouldn't cause the structure to collapse. So there must have been something else going on.
There is another clue in the history of the building to what that could be.
When it was first designed, it was a 4-story building. but when it finished, it had 5 stories above the ground. So you have this 5th floor put on top of an already weakened structure.
An entire extra floor. Could this explain the collapse? According to building records, the new top floor is intended to be lightly loaded. This will reduce the additional load on the building beneath.
In the initial drawings for the 5th floor, it shows a roller rink at that location. A roller rink, of course, is a mostly open space with only the weight of people roller skating around on it.
But this lightly loaded design is never built.
After approval had been granted, the use changed and it was turned into a restaurant floor. And that's nothing like a roller rink. A restaurant, of course, has tables and chairs, the people who are eating, and sometimes some pretty heavy equipment in order to provide those services.
This fundamentally changes things.
The structural load calculations for the roller rink suggested that it would need to support about 1 ton for every square meter. When it's changed to a restaurant floor, the load goes up to about 1.5 tons per square meter, but they don't recalculate. And that's a very significant increase in load.
And photographic evidence from the site reveals clues that this additional floor was inherently weaker than the floors below.
A big divergence from the original design was that the columns were supposed to be 80 centimeters in diameter with 16 rebars. But the 4th and 5th floor columns weren't like that when the building was finished.
Rebar is the steel reinforcement buried inside the concrete columns.
8 of the 16 columns had been reduced from 80 centimeters diameter down to 60 centimeters diameter, and the amount of reinforcing steel in the columns had been cut in half.
That decision has consequences.
Reducing the column sizes is going to make the structure weaker.
The reduced diameter also means the same load is pressing on a smaller ceiling area. This increased pressure can lead to the columns literally punching through the floor above. It's known as a punching shear failure. And analysis of photographs of the wreckage site clearly show this has occurred. Steel reinforcement was originally in the floor slabs that were at right angles to the column. But as the column punched through the floor slab, it has been twisted through 90 degrees and bent over against the column. This is unequivocally punching shear failure. Despite all its many flaws, Sampoong stays up for 6 years. What triggers the actual collapse? An eyewitness statement from a cook working in a 5th floor restaurant provides a vital clue. As he runs into the emergency stairs, the ceiling above him collapses. There is only one thing above the 5th floor ceiling: the roof. This photograph taken on the day of the collapse clearly shows the beginning of punching shear failure. What has made the roof so vulnerable? Analysis of aerial images from 1989, the year before Sampoong is opened, shows yet another unauthorized change to the design: AC units.
They decided to install very large air conditioning units on the roof. And there's no mention of these in the original design.
The commercial AC units at Sampoong weigh 15 tons each. But when operating, they are filled with water. This doubles the weight to 30 tons. And there are 3 of them.
Once the structural plans were submitted and approved, these units were brought in, which brought, of course, considerable additional weight on top of the structure.
This aerial image shows the AC units are originally placed on the east side of the building. But images from the wreckage clearly show them sitting on the west side. These massive 15-ton units have been moved. Could this be the trigger for the collapse? Around 2 years before the Sampoong department store collapses, records confirmed that the giant AC units on the roof are moved, following complaints about their noise.
These are massive equipment and they are very heavy. What they should have done is to bring a crane to lift it very gently and to put it on the other side.
But that's not what happens. Instead, the company moved the AC units by loading them onto wheels and rolling them across the roof. A roof supported on undersized columns. And eyewitness evidence suggests they cannot bear this concentrated load.
Large cracks formed once the AC units were moved from one part of the roof to the other.
According to witnesses, one column under the AC wheels, column 5E, appears to suffer most.
You have growing cracks over time, particularly around this column 5E. The fact that these cracks are concentrated around one of the columns could be signs of imminent punching shear failure.
We can now piece together the evidence to explain the Sampoong disaster. Around 2 years before the collapse, 3 15-ton AC units are wheeled across the roof. This overstresses undersized columns on the 4th and 5th floor. Cracks appear in the roof slab above these columns.
These cracks are unstable. The crack width was increasing with the vibration from these air conditioning units.
The roof cracks created by the AC units continue to grow.
There were multiple warnings over the 2 years following the movement of those air conditioning units about cracks in the 5th floor, but all of these were ignored.
At 5:57 p.m. on June 29th, the roof fails by punching shear, probably beginning at column 5E.
Then you've got the weight of the roof, plus 90 tons of air conditioning unit that's all moving and impacts the floor below.
The main structure, weakened by modifications for escalators and fire shutters, fails under the avalanche of collapsing floors above.
That then falls down and continues the pancake collapse through the building.
It takes less than 20 seconds for the entire building to come down. Thousands are inside. 502 of them are killed. In the aftermath of the disaster, the truth about how the building ended up so badly weakened finally comes to light.
A subsequent investigation reveals that Jun Lee, the owner of the building, made these changes to the construction against the strong advice of engineering firms that were working on it. Jun Lee is found guilty of criminal negligence and sentenced to 10.5 years in prison. His son, the CEO, is found guilty of accidental homicide and corruption and sentenced to 7 years. And all told, 12 officials are found guilty of corruption as a result of this catastrophe.
The Sampoong building collapse has a profound effect on Korean society.
The public is shocked by the catastrophe, and months of protest, including street clashes, follow the incident. A countrywide program of building investigation reveals that hundreds of buildings are in serious violation of safety and engineering codes, and several are on the verge of collapse. The ultimate conclusion of the government inquiry is that only 2% of the high-rises actually meet the safety codes.
The Sampoong building collapsed in front of people's eyes. But some disasters happen without anyone noticing. Susquehanna River, Pennsylvania. 3 Mile Island's giant nuclear power plant produces enough energy to supply 900,000 American homes.
Since the 1950s, nuclear energy had been sold to the American public as this great source of energy that would be clean and it would be cheap and it would be efficient.
Life in the young and growing nuclear age will become richer and more meaningful.
Nuclear power was going to revolutionize America.
On March 28, 1979, at 4 a.m., that dream dies.
Serious trouble today at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania.
Operators at the massive nuclear power plant lose control of Reactor 2.
3 Mile Island is heading towards disaster. It's at risk of entering into core meltdown.
And we know just how deadly that could be.
3 Mile Island is going through a process very similar to what eventually caused the cataclysm at Chernobyl.
Look at the area around Chernobyl, uninhabitable for decades to come. And imagine this happening in central Pennsylvania.
Directly across the river are close to 5,000 people living in Londonderry Township.
Attention, please. There has been a state of emergency declared on 3 Mile Island.
Using eyewitness statements, data from the control room, and the remains of the damaged reactor, we will digitally reconstruct the disaster. How do things go so catastrophically wrong? No one spots the first signs of disaster at the nuclear plant on 3 Mile Island.
3 Mile Island's problems begin with something relatively minor.
According to plant operation logs, it begins in the unit housing reactor number 2. Using data from the accident, we can digitally dissect what happens in this part of the plant. Operators initially report a fault with the feedwater pump. This is part of the system that generates steam for the electricity generators by extracting the incredible volumes of nuclear heat from water surrounding the reactor's core. According to the logs, at 4 a.m., the feedwater pump stops working. The problem is, cooling water is absolutely essential to keep the reactor safe.
A nuclear reactor is a little bit like Goldilocks. It has to be just right. If you produce too little heat, then you're not going to produce steam and you're not going to drive the turbines. But if you produce too much heat, that's even worse because then you get a meltdown. So as long as you keep extracting the heat as fast as it's being produced, everything's fine.
With no cooling water flowing, the huge quantity of heat continuously generated inside the reactor is no longer being removed.
Now, by itself, the cooling water pumps failing shouldn't have been a big problem. There are backup pumps.
In the control room, they could see that lights had come on, saying that the backup pumps were working, which sounds like great news. But unfortunately, though the backup pumps were running, the water wasn't actually flowing.
What goes wrong with the backup pumps?
Maintenance records show that a few days earlier, there'd been some testing carried out, and those tests required the pump's valves be shut, and they simply weren't opened again.
As far as the control room is concerned, the backup pumps are working. They have no idea that the reactor isn't being cooled down anymore.
That delicate balance that's so essential for a nuclear power station to work is still producing all that heat, but it's not being taken away. And this is a disaster waiting to happen.
But there are multiple layers of safety systems in the 3 Mile Island reactor. Why don't those protect the plant? According to the plant's logs, just 3 seconds after the pump failure, pressure and temperature within the reactor start to climb because of the vast heat being generated by the nuclear core.
As the temperature inside the reactor increases, the water inside starts to expand, and that increases the pressure inside the reactor.
Excess pressure is dangerous, so this event triggers another automatic safety system. The plant logs record that 8 seconds after the pump stops, a safety valve responds to the rising pressure by opening. This extracts reactor coolant to reduce the pressure to safe levels. The log shows that 5 seconds after the valve opens, another safety system is triggered.
The reactor's control systems notice this increase in heat and decide to lower the control rods. And what that means is they're absorbing some of the neutrons, damping down that nuclear reaction, and removing the main source of heat inside the reactor.
These safety systems are triggered automatically, exactly as designed, and exactly as the control room operators expect in the rapidly escalating situation. After 13 seconds, pressure in the reactor chamber drops back to safe levels. The safety valve has done its job, and the light indicating that it is open goes out.
What we know from the operators in the control room was that there was a light on the control board that they thought meant that the safety valve was shut.
But that doesn't fit with plant records. They show that the pressure in the reactor continues to drop. Yet the indicator light is telling the operators that the safety valve that initiates the pressure drop is now closed. But plant schematics tell a different story about this indicator light.
The command has been sent to the safety valve, but that light doesn't give any indication whether the valve has actually obeyed that command that's been sent.
The indicator light tells them nothing about what the valve itself is doing.
And that means there's a very simple explanation for the fall in pressure. The safety valve isn't closed at all. It's stuck open.
3 Mile Island is designed to operate under pressure, but with the safety valve stuck open, the coolant was just going to boil off. It's going to disappear.
Even though the reactor has shut itself down, it still needs coolant.
The reactor is still producing a residual heat called decay heat, and that's going to continue for a while. And as long as it continues, you still need cooling water.
The temperature of the nuclear core is continuing to rise towards meltdown, and no one in the plant or in the nearby town has any idea that a nuclear disaster is looming.
The risk of a meltdown in a nuclear reactor is so serious that they created a system called the Emergency Core Cooling System as a backup system that floods the nuclear reactor in an emergency with high-pressure water.
Logs show that as coolant levels in the reactor continue to fall, the emergency cooling system does start automatically. But according to eyewitness testimony, a minute later, the operators shut it down.
Shutting down the emergency cooling system is probably the single most dangerous mistake of this whole crisis.
Why do they turn off such a vital system? 3 Mile Island is heading towards nuclear meltdown, and nobody can see it.
You can't look directly into a reactor chamber, and so for the operators in the control room to kind of figure out what's happening inside the reactor, they have to look at all these switches and dials and gauges that they have on their control board and put the pieces of the picture together.
And this time, they get it wrong.
What they think is happening is that the water level in another part of the water system is rising, and they've been told never to let that water rise too high. So what they do is they shut down the emergency core cooling system before it pumps in too much water.
This is, in effect, the last line of defense against meltdown, and they have just turned it off. Eyewitness statements suggest they then make the situation even worse.
Still thinking the problem was too much water inside the reactor, they opened something called the letdown system, draining even more coolant from the overheating core.
Nearly 80 minutes after the crisis begins, the control room operators report loud vibrations coming from the reactor.
Banging and crashing noises are really not what you want to hear from a nuclear reactor. And what's going on here is that the reactor coolant levels have gotten so low that the pumps are trying to circulate steam as well as water, and they're just not designed to do that. This is now a rapidly deteriorating situation. The coolant waters are catastrophically low, but the operators just don't realize it.
Instead, concerned that the pumps are being damaged, the operators shut them down.
This is terrible because it means there's actually no cooling water whatsoever now getting to the core.
And throughout this whole crisis, precious cooling water continues to escape from the stuck safety valve.
Based on the rate of coolant loss, we think that sometime around 6 a.m., so that's 2 hours after the disaster started, the water level is getting so low that it begins to dip below the top of the reactor rods. And now things are getting really serious.
This is the beginning of a core meltdown, exactly what causes the Chernobyl disaster. Temperatures in the reactor are becoming so high that the nuclear fuel rods are melting.
And that means that they form this sort of horrible radioactive slag known as corium, which starts to make its way down to the bottom of the pressure vessel.
If the white-hot corium melts through the steel reactor container, huge quantities of radiation could pour from the plant for years.
The corium created at the Chernobyl disaster is still lethally radioactive 40 years after the incident.
Pennsylvania is on the brink of nuclear catastrophe. At 6:18, 2 hours and 18 minutes into the crisis, the control room finally realizes the safety valve is stuck open. By this point, half the nuclear fuel has melted.
Radiation alarms are going off all across the site. The plant operators are starting to get some inkling of how serious an incident this is. They declare an emergency.
3 Mile Island is now just 30 minutes from total core meltdown.
It's only at this point that folks in the outside world start to realize just how dangerous the situation is becoming.
There is just one option left: get water back into the superheated reactor at any cost. The operators finally begin emergency cooling protocols. It avoids nuclear catastrophe by the narrowest of margins. But restoring a reliable continuous flow of coolant takes almost 16 hours. Finally, the temperatures in the core start to drop.
By this time, the interior of the reactor has been reduced to 20 tons of radioactive slag that are resting at the bottom of the containment vessel.
Reactor 2 has been destroyed. It will never generate electricity again.
We're really lucky it didn't melt through the pressure vessel and get out into the environment. If it had, it would have irradiated hundreds of square miles of Pennsylvania. 3 Mile Island came so close to being a really serious nuclear disaster.
We can now piece together the evidence and explain the 3 Mile Island meltdown. At 4 a.m. on the 28th of March, a pump circulating water from the turbine stops working.
The valves in the backup pumps are closed so they don't kick in. The reactor coolant instantly begins to heat up, and the pressure shoots up.
The rising pressure automatically triggers a safety valve to open, and the control rods drop to shut down the core.
With the nuclear reactor shut down and the pressure dropping, the safety valve should shut. The indicator light is saying that it's shut, but in reality, it's still stuck open.
Cooling water pours out of the reactor through the stuck valve. This triggers the emergency cooling system.
Because the operators can't make sense of the indications they're getting, they shut off the emergency cooling system. They think they're just following protocol.
They then drain even more reactor coolant. It is a disastrous call.
2 hours after the crisis begins, the core starts to melt.
3 Mile Island very nearly becomes America's Chernobyl.
I don't even know whether it's right to call this lucky, but this disaster could have been so much worse.
On the 1st of April, 4 days after the feedwater pump stopped, the crisis is officially declared over. The cleanup operation begins. 140,000 people have fled the area.
People who fled their homes are returning. And there are even jokes now, including a T-shirt printed, "I'm from Harrisburg and I glow in the dark."
The cost of the cleanup is over $1 billion. It takes 14 years, and reactor number 2 is a total write-off.
The real consequences that follow are the disastrous public confidence hit that 3 Mile Island causes with regards to nuclear power.
The American public never views nuclear energy the same way again.
Even though no one was harmed in the incident and no radioactive material was released, over 100 nuclear power stations are canceled before the first brick is even laid.